Thank you very much. Thémis, I'm going to sit because I have less energy than our American friends. And so I'm Andreea Ernst. I work at the University of Paris-Nanterre, like Marie Personas, who will speak right after. And my talk today is about the question we want to ask is there a social psychology as we would like it to be in the age of radicalization, whatever this term really covers. And I'm actually just a voice giving a talk for a group of people, a group of friends who actually did this reflection together. And I'd like to name my co-author, Professor Yechiel Klar from the University of Tel Aviv, and the two eminent British colleagues who are Steve Reicher and Nick Hopkins, who are not here today. So the story I want to tell you started with a question that was very strong, that came very strong in France in 2015, which were, of course, the terrorist attacks. And we wanted to know why did the recruitment by ISIS, why did the recruitment by ISIS work so well on internet with the French youth? And we found some propaganda material from ISIS, and we decided to study it. And I'll just try to show you a few. Okay, so we need to confirm we're over 18. Just to show you a few seconds for you to see what type of propaganda they do. You will notice that it's in French, so it's not meant to anyone else than French youth. So let's see if so this was used actually for the revendication of the attacks in November 13.
وإن أردتم موعود الله فجاهدوا في سبيل الله وحرضوا المؤمنين واصبروا على تلك المشقة ولو علمتم ما في الجهاد.
So this is al-Baghdadi speaking.
لما قعد أو تخلف منكم أحد عن الجهاد. L'allégeance et émigre vers ta terre, crie de tout ton cœur vengeance, car tu ne peux plus te taire. Dans ta main pour l'allégeance et émigre vers ta terre, crie de tout ton cœur vengeance, car tu ne peux plus te taire.
Les standards
s'est élevé, le califat est arrivé. Oh, toi qui en as tant rêvé, il est temps pour toi d'émigrer.
So basically, that's what they're telling young French. Plead allegiance to the caliphate and come here because you've been humiliated and your place is not basically in France, but here with us. So we did a study. I'm not going to enter into the details with the second and third generation of French kids with immigrant background. It's very easy to do in the University of Nanterre, which is located between the prison and the Gare RER. So it's a place where you can, our students, actually Marie knows well that our students are probably 80% from an immigrant background from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's easy to meet with them and speak with them about anything. The question we wanted to ask and how this reflection started, we tried to understand how do these radical voices, well, we started from the idea that recruitment online only works if the target proactively engages with the message that they hear. And then the question was, how do the voices, the radical voices, make sense more for this youth than any other regular voices? So do they listen to the in-group love? Do they listen to the out-group hate? What moves them? How do they identify? How do they fit within the French society? Yes or no? How do they view themselves? Do they view themselves as French or as Muslim or as French Muslims or as Maghrebian French? So if you want me, I'll give you more details about the research itself in the question and answer session. For now, I just wanted to tell you why we think that this topic is important and why we think that the social representation approach is extremely relevant to study this phenomena. why it's important to study them in general? Because we saw well that that the public understanding of terrorism and radicalization is important in the current climate, both in Europe and, as we very recently saw, in the US. And the social representations of this phenomena may be decisive, both in terms of the escalation of current tensions and in terms of radicalization trends at both sides of the spectrum, not just jihadi radicalization, but also, as Serge mentioned before, far-right and fascist radicalization in France, in Europe, and elsewhere. So we think that in order to reduce and prevent homegrown radicalization and co-radicalization trends, we need to look beyond the tip of the what is called the radicalization iceberg, and actually tackle the challenge of how interactions within the French society actually contribute to produce this type of phenomena. So what we know is that much of the current social research on violent radicalization and on terrorism put the focus on on the terrorists. So we know quite well their minds, their motivations, their needs, their narratives, their networks. We know how they move along the escalatory stages of radicalization. So there's kind of a lot to know from that we know already from coming from cognitive approaches to sociology, to anthropology, to ethnological sociology, from even social psychology with the work of our distinguished colleague Ari Kruglanski. We know a lot also from pathological or even psychoanalysis work. But from these perspectives, terrorism and radicalization, especially the current jihadi radicalization, appear as a plague that is inflicted on the Western societies from the outside, especially Middle East, North Africa, and inflicted by the other. And that other is so visibly alien that we don't understand, who dresses differently, mistreats their women differently, does not seem to enjoy our enlightened society. Now, a consequence of such a view in which terrorism appears in the name of jihad creates a boundless suspicion towards the Muslims in general, entails that the way to avoid terrorism is to somehow insulate the West from what is viewed as Muslim threat. As we witness, as we've been witnessing for a while now in the xenophobic trends against European citizens, many of them confused between the terrorists themselves and the wave of refugees coming from war zones in Syria and Iraq. So the solution would be, from this perspective, that Europe puts a border between us and them. But what actually happens is that most of the jihadi terrorism in Europe is homegrown. These are kids that were born and raised in Europe, and they are as much European citizens as the far right. The far right activists who are, however, much less viewed as a threat. They are not outside our societies, but they are inside, and this brings into equation the interactions, the relationship between them and us, those who perceive themselves as autochthones, the authorities, or the ordinary citizens. Well, driven by a quest of generality and of universality, the approaches that have been taken, most of the approaches taken in social sciences on these topics, are somehow limited because sometimes they don't allow us to understand how intergroup quietness turns into intergroup violence. We don't know how being an Armenian in Ottoman Turkey was tolerable, although not particularly comfortable, and then it turned to be a subject of genocide in 1915. We don't know why the pre-World War I relative comfortability of being Jewish in Germany or Europe in general turned into Holocaust. We don't know how Sunnis, Alawites, together with Arameans, Druzim, Kurds, Yazidis, and Christians could live side by side, although perhaps not always in loving terms, in Syria and sometimes even view themselves as Syrian, and how this has been turned into the current bloodbath. Juan Pérez also recently addressed this question by pointing to how white and black people lived together since antiquity, and only in the 16th century with the exploitation and slavery, the whites started to finally socially perceive the black people as a social category, by that giving an existence to them as black people and as social category. And Juan Pérez also noted that the general processes that are studied in social cognition in intergroup relations, as they apply to prejudice in general, are insufficient to understand ethnic prejudice, because they don't explain why, at a specific time in history, a particular group becomes persecuted. How does a group decide at a particular time in history what would be the other groups that will be its victims? So we have quite a number of theories, among which social representations theory, the social identity theory, the realistic conflict theories. But what we claim is that historical literacy and other kinds of literacies are also vital for deepening our understanding. So the other strong claim that we make is that groups view each other and their relationship, how they view each other and how they view their relationship, is a matter of the dynamics of their interactions. And in this, a focus on historical factors and on historical grievances might play a major role. Such approaches, which we term as interactionists, focus not just on groups or individuals, but on their interactions and on the evolution of their interaction in time. On the one hand, such approaches theorize phenomena like radicalization, using an analytic gaze which Moscovici had termed as psychosocial gaze, rather than seeking to explain the action purely in terms of characteristics or internal factors, or purely in terms of social factors. They analyze how interactions and how psychological processes are shaped in and by the social context, especially intergroup interactions. And on the other hand, such approaches view historical perspectives and also political, religious, and perhaps even economical perspectives as crucial for the understanding of recognition and misrecognition processes. What makes young kids who are 18, 20, born in France to parents from immigrant background, be called in France today Arabs, when they are as French as, perhaps more French than me, or many of you. So we do have these analytic tools, but we would be well advised to consult political science colleagues about the political history of the countries, a demographer about the ethnic and religious composition of countries, a geopolitical expert about the evaporation of nation states in Middle East or in North Africa, the role of colonization and decolonization, scholars of religion, and so on. All this knowledge, we argue, could help creating an informed frame of reference about the specific conflict that we are studying, and to inform the suggested psychological theories that we can use to understand these phenomena. So the other benefit, and perhaps more innovative but also more controversial, is that granting such a literacy a larger place in our explanatory frameworks could help us bridge between us and them, and also bridge between levels of analysis, between the intra and inter-individual levels of analysis in intergroup relations. Because these phenomena are, of course, phenomena that exceed the individual mind. So cognitive approaches or social cognitive approaches, we claim that they are insufficient to be relevant to study processes like radicalization. The other thing is that these processes occur on a much larger time scale than the individual time scale. And for this, we need to take into account the temporal dimension, whether we do it by taking into account the historical evolution of the relationships, or as social psychologists, by bringing in the positional level of analysis, which considers the difference in the positions, in the social positions that are prior to the current interaction. So by that, they introduce a temporal dimension in the analysis of social relations. And we claim that this level would replace intergroup relations in the social and historical time, which are theirs. Okay, so there is some literature in the social representation research that actually goes back to the late 80s, and to Gemelli's work on the transformation of social representations, and also to Serge Moscovici and Juan Pérez's work on the change of status of minorities and victimhood. And recently we know from data from post-communist Eastern Europe that it does take a generation to move representations, social representations from one state to another. So I can come back to that in the question and answer sessions if you want. But this generational timescale is important, and it can be captured in research when we recall that social representations are organized, of course, around this double system that most of you probably know: the central core, which is stable in time, consensual, meaning-making, and the peripheral system, which reflects the inter-individual and situational variability. So there is recent research that showed that the central elements of a social representation are key to defining a group's social identity, explaining how and why some opinions only, but not others, become normative and drive typical processes of black sheep, for example, effect, which involve both identity and group norms. These studies brought structural evidence to the idea that the basis of ethnic prejudice is not in the type of the target group, the victim, but rather in the type of ideal or pure group to which the members of the victimizing group aspire, as Juan Pérez recently noted. Of course, we need further research on this, but okay, so what is new under the sun? Well, we know that from Durkheim that every time that we try to explain a social phenomenon by trying to identify purely psychological factors, we may rest assured that the explanation is false. We therefore argue for an enlargement of the perspective to not just study the radicals and their minds, but the interactions with the rest of society, to enlarging the time focus of our research, and perhaps this painfully questions our methods, as Serge and Camilla brought it to our minds. We may want to question more than the individual. We may want to look at how individuals think that others in their group and in the opposing group think. And actually yesterday evening, okay, I did my presentation, and then I went back to one of the very nice books in 1972 that was edited by Israel and Tashfel, in which both Moscow and Tashfel had a chapter, both of them foundational, and I found that everything that I was going to say today was actually already said. So I'm not sure what my contribution was. I was a bit destabilized, perhaps just to remind the methodological openness that we inherited from Moscow, and that's it. Thank you very much.